Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Wednesday video. And this time we have two guests, as you might have noticed, and we're going to be discussing primarily a book that they've written together. So we have Vince O'Hara, who you may recognize from a couple of videos he's already done very generously with the channel, and a new arrival, Leonard Heinz, who is to my left, but I have no idea how this is going to show up in the recording, so take that with a pinch of salt. And the book we're going to be talking about today is called Innovating Victory, Naval Technology in Three Wars, picture appearing on the screen at the moment. Now, of course, during the period that the book covers, which is effectively the first half of the 20th century, there are a lot of technologies, but you can't talk about them all unless you want to fill an entire bookshelf or make a book which, as I like to say, the kind of book that is good reading material, but also a good melee weapon and or bullet sponge. And in the interests of having their readers sane by the end of it, Leonard and Vince have chosen 6 technologies, and we're going to have a bit more of a chat about them in a minute. But before we go further on, let's learn a little bit more about our guests. So Vince, as you're the returning guest, just if you would like to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure, and thank you, Drock. We really appreciate the opportunity to appear on your channel once again. And my name is Vincent O'Hara. I'm a naval historian of the early 20th century, specializing primarily in World War II. I've written a number of books, mostly for Naval Institute Press. And this book is a collaboration with Len. Len and I have also co-authored a book on World War I naval combat. And we found it a really enjoyable task and a really interesting subject to work upon. So I'll keep my comments at that point and let Len introduce himself.
All right.
Yeah, I'm Len Heinz. As Vince said, I've been a co-author with him on a couple of books. Drac, I know when you were in the U.S., you met Othais. Othais describes himself as a determined idiot rather than an expert on anything. And I think of myself as a determined idiot when it comes to naval history. I don't hold myself out to be an expert on anything, but I love taking a dive into a topic that I knew very little or not much about before.
Excellent. Well, that's how most of us get involved in history, I tend to find anyway. So everyone's in good company.
Len sells himself a little bit short there, I believe. So.
I mean, I've certainly found, and you would probably share the sentiment when it comes to learning about naval history. It's the kind of thing of you start off, you find a thing, you think, oh, I know everything about this thing. And it's like climbing the first ridge of a mountain only to come over and see the peak in front of you. And like, there's a lot more to this.
Yeah,
and then
a lot
repeat
more to know.
pretty much forever and a day.
Yeah, I think of it as, you pull the thread and things just continue to unravel and unravel and unravel as you find more thread to pull.
Yeah. I mean, I've recently, at the time we're recording this, I've recently just finished up another segment on my ongoing series on the US Navy's fleet problems. And, oh boy, was that fun. Because, relatively easy to find public domain material on it is very thin on the ground for some reason. And then there's a few thesis and small pamphlet books that have been published that are a little bit harder to find, but they provide a reasonable amount of information. And then when you finally crack the labyrinthine ways of the US National Archives and get the actual reports, you look at it as like, how could anyone write over 1,000 pages on this one exercise? It wasn't that interesting. But there you go. Anyway, moving on to the actual topic that we're talking about. So when it comes to innovating victory, what is the purpose of the book, and how did you select the particular technologies that you chose to cover?
I'll take first crack at that. The book kind of had a interesting gestation. We were nibbling around the edges of some of the various technologies when we were kicking around what our next book was going to be. And as I consider myself like a user of naval history. I don't produce naval history, but I certainly use it to create my work. And I've developed a lot of questions over the course of the last 20 years in writing on the topics that I write on. And one of the most interesting or most difficult topics is how was technology used by who and when? And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence there, but if you're talking like radar, for example, which is kind of like the poster child technology of World War II, it makes a big difference about who is doing what when. So if you look at radar in 1939, it's one thing. If you look at it in 1942, it's a completely different thing. And by 1945, it's the third thing, at least for certain users. I think, in 1945, maybe the Japanese were where the Americans were in 1942, for example. 1938, the Germans were where the British were in 1940. So it makes a big difference when, who, and where. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to address in this book is give a framework to the development of naval technology on an international basis, not just on a US or British basis, trying to say what it was like for the French, for example. That was one of the inspirations behind this book. I'll let you continue that thread, Len.
Yeah, to me, the attraction in doing the book was to shift the focus in how and I think a lot of people tend to look at naval history. I mean, naval history is, not surprisingly, often addressed like any kind of narrative history. Accounts are written based on chronologies. Things happen in a certain order. One theater of operations might be covered, one war might be covered. This was an opportunity to kind of flip that 90 degrees and say, okay, instead of focusing on the chronology of things and focusing on, one conflict or even one navy, let's look at this from the perspective of the technologies themselves. And then, as Vince said, let's see, when you look at the technologies, how does that illuminate how different navies developed these technologies, how different navies found them useful or not so useful. And that in turn kind of drove us to selecting the technologies that we did. As we said in the book, we have two weapons platforms, we have two weapons, and we have two of what we call tools, radar and radio. And again, the idea was let's try to get the broadest possible perspective on how different navies use the technologies, rather than focus on a particular navy in a particular era or a particular conflict.
Yeah, and just for reference for the viewers, those new platforms are submarines and aircraft, the new weapons are torpedoes and mines, and as you mentioned, the tools are the radar and radio. And I think it is very definitely something that's important, as you mentioned, Vince, to put it in the context of not just that these technologies existed, but when and how each particular set of people are using them. So you mentioned obviously the relative positions of everybody when it comes to radar in World War II, but thinking from my own work, looking at things like the use of radio in World War One, the Germans have it and the British have it, but they utilize it in very, very different ways with commensurately different effects. So just a surface reading of, oh yeah, both sides had radio, therefore assume that both sides can do X. That may not actually hold true, because one side may be doing X all the time. The other side may never conceive that X is even possible.
So one of the things that came out of this for us was the way that different navies will use the same technology in such different fashions. Radio being one example, and that's not really all that apparent to people who approach the technology from the technical aspects of it. If you're looking at frequencies and revolutions per minute, measurements like that, it seems like it's all one thing. But if you're looking at it from the point of view of how it was used, how it was intended to be used, and radar again is another good example, radio is another good example, but even mines and torpedoes, submarines, everybody used their platforms, weapons, and tools differently. And I think that's one of the things that the book brings out that I wasn't really expecting to be such a prominent theme when we first started.
Yeah, different use, clearly drove the development path of these technologies in different navies. I mean, as Vince said, radio is a good example. Radar, I think, is a great example. As we say in the book, in contrasting the German use of radar versus the American and British use of radar. I mean, the Americans and the British were very much into let's build a lot of radar sets and let's put them in a lot of different platforms. The Germans didn't see the utility of that to the degree that the British and the Americans did, and the Germans also took the view of, well, for the war we're fighting, radar is a transmission. When you're using radar, you're broadcasting your position. That might not be such a good thing for us. So you see the Germans develop radar detectors. That's where a lot of their technological focus is when you look at how the radar war developed between the two different sides. And yeah, I mean, mines are another example of that. I mean, the basic idea of, well, do you need them? Very much depends upon the Navy's view of how important mines are going to be for the strategic plans it has for the war it's going to fight. We talk about the fact that the Russians, had some direct experience with mines in the Russo-Japanese War, but they also realized that, particularly in the Baltic, mines are going to be key to their strategic conception of how they were going to fight a war there. The British didn't really see the strategic uses for mines. And
mines interfered with navigation. How can we go into the North Sea and beat up the Germans if we have to worry about mines?
Yeah, and also if we put a bunch of mines in front of the Germans, they might not come out, and we sure don't want that.
It might blockade them in. Wow.
Yeah. I think the thing that the one thing that I've always found the funniest about the British mines in World War I is not so much when they eventually get around to using them, it's more the fact that Admiral Jellicoe's first attempt at a depth charge was to just take what was by that point a standard anti-shipping mine, so something that's designed to blow a hole in the side of a dreadnought, and just replaced the flotation device with a hydrostatic pistol and said, here, chuck this over the back, I'm sure that'll kill a sub. It's like, technically yes. After having shattered several ship sterns and bent a few props, they decided maybe they need a slightly smaller charge.
Yeah. Well, that's
although they were fortunate in that they actually went off, which tended not to be such a thing with mines early on. I mean,
it's also an excellent example of how you never know how technology is going to work until you actually use it in combat.
Right.
And the theory is always inevitably one thing, but the practice is always another thing. And that's just a minor example, but it seems to apply everywhere.
Yeah. And I suppose that's sort of the second part of the question. Apart from, obviously taking three pairs, platforms, weapons, and tools, was there any other particular criteria that you used to select exactly which items of technology you were going to pick for the various categories?
I'll take first stab, Len. I think we were looking for. I mean, there were tons and tons and tons of different choices,
right.
And we had a decision on how specific we wanted to be. Did we want to talk about fire control, or did we want to talk about follow the pointer type arrangements or optics or whatever? You can really drill it down, or you can be very broad in your approach. And because we're writing what is in effect a popular history, we felt it'd be better to be a little bit more popular there. And use technologies that people can identify with, they know about, but that contain a story that is not really well known or apparent. I think the whole history of submarines is one example. Everybody knows what a sub is. Everybody knows about the basic outline of anybody listening to this channel knows the basic outline of Battle of the Atlantic, et cetera, et cetera. But there's so much more to the story, and by taking the big topics, we can address the small topics as appropriate, but we can also open ourselves up to more coverage, and frankly, it's easier to write about submarines in general than it is about metallurgy or some hyper technical thing that's not going to interest people that much. That was one criteria.
And I'd also say. These are technologies that we at least believed we knew something about at the outset. So we weren't reinventing the wheel. I mean, we considered like steam engineering would be an interesting thing to explore, but I don't know very much about steam engineering, and I would be much lower on the learning curve. Now, we discovered as we dug into these technologies that we didn't know nearly as much as we thought we did. And part of the fun of writing the book was discovering what we didn't know and filling in a lot of blanks. But we were, as Vince was saying, these are technologies that are known, that people are comfortable with. And also, although I guess radar is the exception to this, I mean, these were technologies that were developing throughout the 20th century, and in some cases, back into the late 19th century. So there was a development string that you could follow along. They were technologies that were broadly used by different navies in many different ways and in many different iterations as the technology developed over time.
Right, let me add one other thing to that too. It's part of a ongoing process of education for myself. And I ask myself before I write a book project, what do I want to know more about? And the use of naval technology in the early 20th century was something that I felt was important to me professionally as an author to really get a little bit better at. And this is an excellent opportunity to learn. And I know that going forward in my work and in the project that I'm working on now, the book that Leonard and I wrote is a very handy reference and also a very handy guide to further references. So there's that aspect to it as well.
Excellent.
I would add to that and say, yes, if you want a short guide to these technologies, then just look at the bibliography of our book, and you'll get a sense of at least the journey we traveled in learning more about all of them. And I think that's a pretty good reference source.
Yeah, and I think it's having read most of the book at the time of recording, it's definitely an excellent, as you say, it's an excellent guide. It's an excellent introduction to how these technologies work. There's things in there that you wouldn't expect, even if you've read a reasonable amount about naval history of the early 20th century. There are bits in there you're going to find, oh, really? Okay, I'm going to follow that one up. I know I've done that more than a few times. And, it means you can learn an awful lot about these things without having to, build yourself a small fortress of books on specific topics, because, they're as we've said before, there's a book on my shelf called Radar in the Royal Navy, 1939 to 1945. So it's that kind of one nation approach covering one
house,
period.
right?
Yeah,
and
it's
it's thicker than a phone book. But when you get into it, a lot of it is like, well, here's a Type 284 radar, and it has such and such an antenna, and it operates on such and such a frequency at such and such a power. And it's like, well, this is fascinating for an engineer like me. But for the vast majority of people, they're going to look at it and go, I went here to read a book, not a technical manual.
Yeah, there's that aspect to it.
Yeah. So I suppose that leads into the next question, which is, are you technologists, or sort of what prompted you to take a technological view of the innovations of naval warfare?
I'll let you go first, Len.
Okay. Well, as I think we said already, we're not technologists, and we really wanted to take this view because in reading naval history, as Vince said, you begin to understand the role that technology plays in how navies operate, how navies think about their strategic plans, how technology plays into those strategic plans. But there aren't many, if any, books out there that really focus on the interrelationship between naval strategy, naval operations, and technology itself. So even though no, we're not technologists, we felt that we were pretty well placed, given our knowledge of naval history, to see how these technologies were integrated into the way that navies ran in the 20th century.
Also, we're approaching it from the point of view of people it's people like us who would have been required to use the technology.
Mhm.
And not people like us who design the technology. There's a big difference between the designer and the user. And sometimes that difference interfered with the use of the technology itself. And we have repeated examples of that. You don't have to be a admiral or a general to write, naval or military history. And in some respects, it's not a good thing. In other respects, it is a good thing. There's always a trade-off in perspective and in point of view. And as naval historians who focus on operational matters more than technical or personnel matters, we regard technology in a certain way. And I think our point of view is important in appreciating how the technology was used, because radar is worthless if you don't know how to use it, if you don't know when to use it. And that was certainly the case for most radar-equipped ships for the period when the technology was initially introduced. I mean, the examples of captains who threw themselves into the matter to learn how to use this technology was not that many of them. So it's kind of like our point of view, I think, is worthy of consideration in the whole issue of technology and its use.
And I'd also say I actually come at this in a lot of naval history from the perspective of being a naval war gamer.
Mhm.
For me, there's always a relationship between the history and, oh, that's interesting. How would you game that? And when you think about the history and how would you game it, you also come down to, well, I don't really care how the technology works. How the technical details of it. What I really care about is, well, how did it affect a particular action? How did it work in practice? And to understand how a technology works in practice, you don't need to understand all the nuts and bolts. I don't need to build a watch in order to tell time. I need to know how to tell time, and I need to know how other people might tell time based on the kind of watches they have.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly a point that comes out when you're reading the book, is that, and as you mentioned there, Vince, the fact that you can have all this wonderful technology, but if it's inaccessible to the end user, you might as well not have it. And that actually prompted me to go and look up some of the not the technical manuals, but the operating manuals, the things that would be issued to the the ensign or equivalent who'd been given the task of running the thing. And one of the things that definitely followed through from one of the chapters in the book was that when you look at the US Navy's instructions on how to operate a radar set, and the one I looked at was an air search, is literally the first instruction is switch it on. Here is the on switch. It's kind of almost idiot proof, and it's about 2 pages of fairly simple checklists, most of which are to do with calibration, and then it's like, right, now you're ready to go. This means this means this. If this happens, start panicking. And then you look at some other Navy's radar checklists to start up, and it would probably be more comprehensive if it started at like, well, once you've completed the 3rd incantation and turned 16 degrees to the north on an alternate Tuesday when the moon is full, then you can start the 17th step in the activation process. And then you realize, this may also explain why some people were having a lot more success, even though their technology might have been on a rough parity level.
I used to do some technical writing when I was younger, and I have a big admiration for the U.S. Navy's ability to produce tons and tons and tons of technical references and manuals on almost any subject necessary, and do it so well. I was reading their handbook on Middle Eastern countries produced in 1940, and it's excellent stuff. Cookbooks, Navy cookbooks. Wonderful things. Navy radar manuals. I read the Navy radar manual, and it taught me a lot. And I'll say that much. So I think that's one of the factors of naval warfare people just do not pay attention to. It's part of the training, it's part of the human aspects, but the ability to communicate what you need to do in a clear fashion, have a collective knowledge that's contained in your documentation, is not a given. And I think the U.S. Navy did it. I read English, and obviously I'm more sympathetic perhaps to to the types of styles that came out of the 1940s, manuals. But no offense, but they're better than the British stuff I've read by far.
Yeah, well, you could say that again.
I particularly like some of the illustrations in the U.S. manuals.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that holds true across most of the literature. I managed to pick up ship handling manuals for officers from the 1930s for the US and the Royal Navy. And to be perfectly honest, I ended up using the US one as a primer so that I understood what the Royal Navy one was saying, mostly through identifying similar pictures. And we're like, oh, right, they're both talking about this. Okay, now what does the US one say? Right, so that explains this section.
Yeah.
in the British one. I mean, I'm sure if you've had someone standing over you in Dartmouth screaming at you for 6 days solid, you probably understand a bit more. But if you're just picking it up and reading it from scratch, it does not help.
Well, it's important when you're expanding your fleet by a factor of 10 or so. It's important when you're trying to man all these brand new warships and you're trying to find people who can actually captain them. And the tremendous expansion the U.S. Navy went through was made possible, I believe, thanks to material like that. And that's one of the failings of the Japanese. That's why you see, for example, Japanese ship handling kind of degenerate during the course of the war. The Italians were go on and on and on, but I think that's an important point.
We're also sort of at the edge of another major point that certainly emerged for us, which is that you have to view technology in the context of the infrastructure that's required to make it effective. Training people how to use it is one aspect of that, but there were many other aspects of that as well. I mean, the infrastructure necessary to run aircraft, the infrastructure necessary to make effective use of radar. I mean, often the technology that we're looking at, turns out to be the tip of the iceberg in terms of what navies needed to do in order to really make effective use of the technology itself.
For the technology to do what the Navy thought it was supposed to do in the first place, why they funded it and the development, that's important.
Yeah, so I suppose that leads us on to the follow-on question, I guess, which is, I mean, you've chosen 6, but if you had to choose one, what technology had the greatest impact on naval warfare in general, as far as the first half of the 20th century is concerned?
So that's a tough question, and we've asked ourselves that question as well. I mean, first I'd say we think the 6 technologies we picked all had, tremendous effects on naval warfare. It makes it hard to sort between the 2 of them. I'd make and I think you can make an argument for any one of the 6 being the most significant. I personally like radio, and I think that is, well, I'm sure that is in part because I found the radio story to be a very interesting one. I'd also argue that radio begets radar. So you've got a 2-for-1 there. And the use of radio just permeates the way in which many of the other technologies were used. Yeah.
I'll take a slightly different approach to that and say that the technologies that expanded the fields of naval warfare, submarines are the first example because they shifted the arena to the surface of the sea to also below the surface of the sea. And obviously aircraft above the surface of the sea has to be considered another primary technology. I kind of go for those 2. But I'm very sympathetic to Len's arguments there. And obviously radar and radio were fundamental to to the best use of aircraft and submarines as well. Radar less so.
Which leads us to another point, which is the interrelation between all of these technologies. I mean, I take Vince's point, and we've talked over the fact that it's been said, submarines, now you can operate under the sea. Well, the submarine without the torpedo would not be an earth-shattering technology. But the submarine plus the torpedo plus the merchant ship as a target suddenly does become a hugely influential technology.
You look at the history of the torpedo, which we give out in some detail, and you can see that the expectations for torpedoes were tremendous from the very beginning. Everybody can understand you have a weapon, slamming into the side of a ship, and bad things will happen.
Yeah.
But if you look at the operational use of torpedoes throughout the period of the 1860s up to the 1910s,
the Russo-Japanese War,
not much happened. Torpedoes were very ineffective. Torpedoes were sank a couple ships, but not many, and mostly anchored ships at that. So it takes a certain congruity of elements to make a technology effective, and it's really easy to see that with something like torpedoes. You have all the data there, and I think dealing with technology on that level was one of the attractions for us, where you can. It hasn't been said yet, but one of the things that Len and I tried to do in this book was to approach each technology in the same fashion, by talking about its discovery, talking about how it was developed, talking about the expectations that applied to that technology, and then seeing how in warfare those expectations were either disappointed or justified, mostly disappointed, and seeing how the use of the technology evolved in war. And I think doing that in a similar fashion, bang, 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 you can see greater parallels. You can see certain principles that underlie the use of technology. And I think that Len and I were interested in exploring what some of those principles were, or identifying them in the first place, and then exploring them, and hopefully providing information that people who are responsible for our defense and our security right now can take and apply to their continuous and ongoing use of naval technology, because they haven't had the benefit or the horror, as pick your word, of a major war in order to test artificial intelligence, or to test naval drones. It's happening a little bit right now, but we're seeing it's working out a little bit differently than people thought, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was part of the purpose in the way that we selected the technologies, and the way that we tried to impose a certain uniformity in the way that we covered those technologies.
Yeah, and I think it certainly comes through, when you're being walked through the development and the history of those technologies and how they all come to mature in the first half of the 20th century. I came to a bit of a realization, which is that if you look at, let's say, the American Civil War, the South American War in the Pacific, Italy versus Austria, even the Sino-Japanese War in the latter part of the 19th, so all those latter part of the 19th century wars that are involving various flavors of ironclads and pre-dreadnoughts and armored cruisers, and I suppose even to a certain or somewhat more limited extent, the things like the Franco-Prussian War or even the Spanish-American War, an awful lot of the tactics that are being used wouldn't be unfamiliar to someone from the Nelsonian era. And people often look at that era and go, the rate of technological change was so advanced, so different. People would be completely unable to function like 10, 20 years down the line if they'd been trained before. But most of the overall strategy hadn't really changed that much. You were still limited to a few hundred, maybe low thousands of yards in terms of your ability to fire. Your communications were still mostly done by ship or pulling into port. You were, as you highlighted, you're very much still limited to what's happening with surface warfare, armed merchant cruisers, raiders, blockade runners. If you want to find an enemy ship, it's kind of, well, send a bunch of ships out there and hope for the best if you run across each other. And then in the next 30, 40 years, with the technologies covered in the book, if you took a naval officer from, say, 1890 and asked him, okay, how do you fight a war? And you took an officer from 1790, those answers aren't going to be too different. Whereas if you take that officer again from 1890 and you say, well, here's an officer from 1940, only half as much in terms of time ahead, those two ways of fighting war, although the ships actually, visually speaking, are much, much more similar, a pre-dreadnought is much closer to an Iowa class than it is to a ship of the line. The actual way you fight your war has changed completely and utterly, and it's almost entirely down to these technologies that are covered in the book, obviously, and others. But it's a paradigm shift in how you treat warfare, and as you say, the effects are still today.
Information and communications are the big differences between 1900 and 1940 or 1950, if you will.
When you get, we've got all these technologies, they're all coming together over the course of several major wars. But as we've kind of intimated already, some navies are maybe not quite as good at utilizing that technology efficiently, or they use it in a slightly different way. And we've covered to a certain degree, it's in some degree the amount of training that they do. But sort of expanding on that, while you were writing the book, how did you find, in terms of reasons why perhaps some navies were less quick off the ball in using these technologies compared to others?
I'll take this one first.
The biggest single factor that we found was the perceived needs of the Navy. A technology was more attractive or less attractive to a Navy, depending upon how the Navy viewed the need to understand that technology. So, I mean, we were talking about the Royal Navy and mines, for example. I mean, the Royal Navy knew that mines were effective. They had the Russo-Japanese War as an example of that. But mines really didn't play much of a strategic role in the thinking of the folks in the Royal Navy. Now we talk in the book about aircraft and how aircraft were developed, and here you have the Americans and the Japanese sort of outpacing other navies in their development of aircraft. And when you say, well, why was that? Well, one major reason was that they were each thinking about fighting a war in the Pacific over vast distances, where aircraft were pretty clearly going to play a major role, cheek and jowl with ships. There's going to be little separation between the two. So, I mean, there's a couple examples of how perceived use drove how navies approached and developed technologies, in some cases developing them in pretty radically different ways.
Yeah, I think that's the primary consideration when you're talking about how navies use technology. I think another aspect of it that we don't pay enough attention to is the ability to produce that technology. And there's the famous, you read everything you read about the Mediterranean War will tell you that those poor dumb Italians didn't have any radar, and they weren't smart enough to know that they needed radar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the principles that Len described apply in this situation. They had other needs that were of greater interest to them than radar. But once they did get on the program, and once they did try to equip their Navy with radar, they were producing their domestic, usable domestic version at a rate of 4 units per month. Where's my other camera? And you can't equip very many ships at four units per month. When the British discovered the cavity magnetron, one of the very first things they did was ship off an early example to the United States. And they didn't do this because they were generous or because they wanted to help the Americans or because they were, Americans are good guys and all that stuff and the other. No, they did it because the Americans could produce hundreds, if not thousands, of cavity magnetrons very quickly, and the British could not. So they were practical. And this is what made the big difference in the electronics war, as far as I can tell, is the fact that, as we said in the beginning, the Americans and the British could slap a radar set on every aircraft, every motorboat they wanted to. Whereas the Italians had to wait for a year before they could come up with a usable set for their battleships. And that's a big difference in the use of technology. Just giving another example about need, Len was talking about how you only develop the technologies you need. the Germans developed some really interesting and innovative stealth technologies for their submarines. Rubber coatings, the Abelard coating for their subs, or coating their periscopes to make them invisible to radar. Well, Americans never did that. Why should they? Why were we interested in that? When we saw German hydrophonic technology, we were just our socks were knocked off. We thought, wow, we're nowhere close to where the Germans are. But Americans didn't care about passive detectors. They wanted their active detectors, and that's what they developed.
And when they developed their passive detectors, they didn't even use them, the way that the Germans did. For the Germans, they were mainly early warning devices. We've been detected submerged. For the Americans and the American subs in the Pacific had radar detectors as well, and they used them to locate the Japanese. Because they weren't nearly as concerned about what was going to come back against them. And Vince, we talked a lot about radar, but there are other technologies where mass makes a difference as well. Torpedoes, for example. Well, it turns out that you need a lot of torpedoes before the torpedo as a weapon actually makes a difference. So you need the industrial plant, which was significant to produce them. Mines may be the best example. One highly sophisticated magnetic mine is an interesting curiosity. 1,000 of them strewn around the enemy's harbor is a strategic weapon.
Yeah, so I suppose that leads on to there's a fair bit in the books about these 6 technologies, but what more could you have said about the technologies that make it into the book that you had to cut out for time or space reasons that you'd like to sort of bring to the fore?
Well, there are certainly some stories that we came across in researching the book that I for one don't know more about, but would like to know more about. We talk in the book about the sort of the uncanny parallels between the German problems with sub-torpedoes early in their war and the American problems with sub-torpedoes early in their war. Well, the American issues are pretty well covered in the secondary literature. The German issues are far less so. And it'd be interesting to just dive into that and see, well, the Germans certainly had experience with torpedoes in World War I. They apparently even had some experience with magnetic exploders on torpedoes in World War I. And yet, at the beginning of the Second World War, even with some experience in the Spanish Civil War, they still got it terribly wrong. How institutionally did that happen? And then how institutionally did they recover? We know they recovered more quickly than the Americans did. And we have some sense of that from the book, but a deep dive into that, I think, would be.
I think some of the responsible parties were persecuted or prosecuted and had bad results.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the whole the early development of submarines. We were talking with a fellow historian about this, and there's a whole history just to the American adoption of the Holland boat versus Lake designs, which the U.S. Navy subsequently developed. That again, if you wanted to see an organization grappling with new and unproven but promising technology, a deep dive into that would have been, we think, pretty fascinating. I'm sure there are other examples.
Well, other technologies we could have covered. I think the matters of propulsion and the effects of coal and oil upon the way navies fought in the 20th century is something that if I was starting the book over again, I'd probably go for 7 or 8 technologies. There's a lot of things that you can talk about. We didn't even mention fire control in the book hardly at all. And as you know, that's a topic of boundless fascination and endless inquiry that people still disagree with. I guess the whole issue of Italian gunnery is been thrown back up for analysis. You're familiar with some of that, I'm sure, Jared.
Yeah.
I don't know what to believe, what not to believe. But
yeah, well, I mean, why the Italian battleships don't appear to be able to hit the broadside of a barn from inside the barn is something of a rancorous debate in all sorts of historical circles, whether they be online or offline. But I mean, from my own research and talking with some Italian historians who've got access to documents that still remain purely in Italian, I think we've kind of narrowed it down to it's almost certainly a fault with the shells and the charges. There may be some issues with the gun as well, but it certainly doesn't seem to have been a problem with their fire control itself, because the fire control, they seem to have very quickly actually established the pattern and the range. They get the range even at very, very long ranges very, very quickly.
Yes, they do.
It's just that the sort of the CEP of the salvo is so colossally large, it doesn't actually matter whether or not you know exactly where they are. I think at one point I dubbed the Littorio the Eye of Sauron, because it had so many different range finders. There's it's almost impossible for you to not get the range first time with them. But then when your spread's over a kilometer, it fundamentally doesn't matter. It's one of the I can't remember exactly which battle it was. It may have been the run up to Matapan, but there's one picture taken by Time Life magazine where there's a line of British cruisers and one of them's under fire, the one nearest to the camera that's not the cameraman ship. And you can tell it's the one that's under fire because that's what the Italian records say, and that's where some of the water spouts are. But then there's another cruiser about 3/4 of the way to the horizon, and there's a water spout going up beyond it. And using basic trigonometry, you can tell that the distance between the nearest and the furthest spout is about 1.5 kilometers. And you're sort of looking to go, you're actually in more danger in the ship that they're not targeting at this point. But, there's even with the amount of research that's been done at that point, and there was a fairly interesting article in Warship International as well, looking at the shells. But it's still a bit of a mystery.
It's still a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, if you narrowed it down to, well, it's something wrong with this part of the system. Well, great, that happens to be a very complex system.
And also probably something to do with sheer frequency and opportunity. Maybe if the Italians had increased their rate of fire just a little bit, they would have enjoyed a little bit more success.
Yeah, it's there's all sorts of fun issues because, of course, dispersion when it comes to gunnery and fire control is not a purely Italian problem. They just suffered the worst of it with the battleships.
And this is an example, going back to the book, this is an example of some of the alleyways you can go down, the rabbit holes that you go down when you're talking about technology. Something as simple as firing your guns, which is the basic function of most warships. And the permeations, the variables that are involved are just endless almost. And we could have written the book on Italian fire control. It could have been just as long. I don't think it would have been as interesting, but you can go on endlessly, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there have been multiple books written on, every one of these technologies individually that are longer than the book we wrote.
Yeah.
I suppose that means with those technologies left over, I suppose that opens up room for a sequel at some point, which leads on to the next question, which is, of course, as you mentioned at the beginning, this is the second book you've worked on together. The previous one being the naval battles of the Great War, which is also another one that's on my bookshelf. I highly recommend people acquire that if they can.
Clash of Fleets.
Yes, Clash of Fleets. So I guess you've managed to work on two books without wanting to kill each other. So what makes for a good working relationship where you can still stand the sight of each other after multiple years of research and writing and editing?
Well, I think it really helps that you're so handsome, Len. That makes a big difference. No, seriously, I think Len and I have been very effective working together. I'm into collaboration. If people know my work, that I've edited several books, that I've co-authored several books with Len and also with an Italian gentleman. The Fighting in the Dark is an edited work. But I think there's certain qualities to a person that for me to work with the person has to be responsive, They have to be hardworking. They have to be intelligent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Len and I have a certain chemistry that's allowed us to, using this book as an example, we hammered out the topic out over a period of time. And then Len took 3 chapters, I took 3 chapters, we wrote our chapters, and then we homogenized them and, worked them together. And at this point, you can't tell, I don't think, what chapters I wrote and what chapters Len wrote. I think if you look at the book as a whole, you will see that there's a certain standard style to it. And I defy you to tell who wrote the torpedo chapter there. Drac, can you tell me?
Honestly, I couldn't.
I honestly have a hard time remembering who did the draft of each chapter now, because the process is, intensive and extensive. I'd say we went through at least about a dozen drafts of the book before we had a manuscript to submit. So it does get homogenized, although I think we have pretty comparable writing styles and did from the outset, which made collaboration easy. In a former life, I did a lot of collaborative projects, and I also did those projects from a distance. So, Vince is in California, I'm in New Mexico, 1,000 miles away. We wrote in Clash of Fleets, and it was published before we ever met each other face to face, as I recall. Is that right, Vince?
First time we met was it's true.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yes. Yeah. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. So it certainly helped that we both had a background in doing that kind of thing, and we're quite comfortable in doing it. I do think to the point Vince made, when Clash of Fleets was done and published, Vince, I think it was your son who asked you, "Gee, Dad, which part of the book did you write, and which part of the book did Len write?" And I think Vince thought about it for a little bit and said, "We kind of both wrote all of it," because at the end of the day, that's I think if you've done it right, that's how the books should end up. That both authors wrote all of them.
And one thing I've noticed in this process too, working with Len has always been a pleasure. Len's able to put together a sentence in English and have it make sense. Sometimes it makes too much sense, Len. That's.
I understand. I'm accused of over-explaining.
Ex-attorney, what do you want? But one thing that struck me, and one of the reasons why I relish collaboration, is I have a lot of things to say, and I don't really have the time to say everything I want to say. And I've discovered, like with Len, 2 people can work 4 times faster. It seems to be exponential in its effect. And it would have taken me years and years and years to produce Innovating Victory by myself. And Len and I managed to do it in just, a couple of years. And I think the results speak for themselves. And I think I'll say the same thing about Clash of Fleets. I always wanted to do World War I, but I never was going to do it because I never could. And Len and I, the story of how we came together to do that book is kind of fun.
It is.
Yeah. And Len approached me. He sent me a PDF that was like 60 pages long, which was basically a list of all World War I actions he had identified. And said, "Vince, I'm thinking about posting this on some website. What do you think?" I looked at the what Len had produced, and I go, "Len, let me talk to Naval Institute. Why don't you don't post it anywhere?" So I talked to the chief editor at Naval Institute when he was in San Diego, and I said, "Hey, I got this idea," and I had a book contract, the same day, commitment the same day. So we took Len's internet posting, which was basically a huge list, and turned it into a book.
In fact, I can reel the film back a few scenes before that, because the reason I developed the list was because I had gone to Vince a few months before that and said, Vince, I really enjoyed your World War II trilogy of battle histories. are you thinking about doing something like that for World War I? Because I don't think such a thing exists. I mean, there are, a fair number of single volumes on, the, naval
Great naval battles,
but not, not one that really focuses on the battles themselves. And Vince said, well, I was thinking about it, and I don't have the same background there that I did for World War II. You actually sent me, your start of a spreadsheet of, what
that's right.
such a thing would look like, and then, he said no, so maybe this would be useful to you if you want to, go forward yourself. So yeah, then I worked on it and worked on it and worked on it just because I was personally, interested in coming up with a battle history and understanding, well, like, how did navies actually fight in World War I? I mean, everyone knows Dogger Bank, Jutland. Did anything else happen? And the answer, of course, is yes. A lot of other things happened, but you've got to dig to find them and understand them.
How many battles did we classify? 140 or something like that?
Yeah, 132 on the.
Okay, that sounds right. 132
on the spreadsheet, but that didn't count like some minor clashes. We'll never track down all of the instances where the Dover Patrol was shooting guns at the Zeebrugge flotilla, because I think that probably happened every third day. Somebody took a pot shot at somebody.
Well, plus we bring different skills to it as well. In terms of languages, for example, Len's pretty good with German, and I'm a complete idiot when it comes to German, so that's really quite helpful. And we like to, both of us like to consider different points of view. So it's important for me to be able to say, well, the French and the Italians were thinking this way. For me, that's really, you can't talk about navies of the early 20th century if you don't talk about, two of the five most principal navies, the Soviets as well. So that there's different elements that we bring to the table, and I think it's been an effective partnership that we've had. So.
And then finally, I would say it's been an effective partnership because neither of us gets too angry when the other one says, let me tell you why you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not prima donnas particularly. Len just, I met Len because he, you sent me an email or something, and you ended up reading my books for a while. You were a reader for me, and he was a great reader.
Actually, I thought it started when you came across the war game scenarios that I had developed from your World War II battle trilogy.
Oh, that could be.
Yeah, because you emailed me and said, that's pretty neat. I really hope that someone who was a war gamer would take these accounts of the battles and translate them into scenarios for war games. And then we started to exchange lists of naval actions in World War II, in an attempt to come up with a single complete list, and it kind of rolled on from there.
Probably too much information, but there it is.
No, it's good, and I mean it's certainly, speaking of a clash of fleets, again, I would say, if you're interested in naval history of World War I, definitely pick it up because, but as you mentioned, Len, most people like Jutland, Dogger Bank, something, and I think from that you get this kind of pop culture myth of and something that actually appears regrettably in some fairly serious works, of this kind of idea that you have massive fleet number 1 and massive fleet number 2, and they kind of sit there staring at each other for 4 years and very briefly will pop out and have a couple of goes at each other, and that's it. And that, apart from that, and maybe something to do with U-boats, that's all most people then think of World War I. It's like a big staring contest waiting for the other guy to blink. But as Clash of Fleets shows, actually, okay, maybe the two big battle fleets don't take a crack at each other every second Wednesday, but practically everybody else in the High Seas Fleet and the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale and the Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine and the Ottoman Navy, whatever they call that, and the Imperial Russian Navy, etc., they were going hammer and tongs at each other with practically everything that wasn't a dreadnought battle fleet as any time they could. And I think it definitely serves as a good reference for me if I'm like, well, what interesting unknown battle can I talk about today? But it's also just a very, very good way of pointing out to people that, you know, sometimes the common narrative is not actually anywhere close to being correct. And I think the same thing comes through with Innovating Victory. There's a number of elements that you point out for all of those technologies, which kind of, they fly in the face a little bit of some of the very sort of short form pop history. Well, this is how this affected the war. But the important thing is that, unlike a quick two-second statement of, you know, so and so had radar and so didn't, the point is you've got the evidence to prove actually that's not how it worked out, and this is how it worked out instead, which a lot of times, as I think I may have mentioned in a previous chat I had with Vince, I actually find it quite refreshing from a general perspective, but also especially, I suppose, from a perspective of having had the fortune to be born in one of the quote unquote winning nations of both wars, is that there sometimes can be a tendency to downplay the capabilities of the opposition. It's kind of like, we won because we were so much better than them. But at the same time, I find that a little bit irritating, because it's kind of like, well, if we were so much better than the Italians, if we were so much better than the Germans, etc., why did it take 6 years to win? Why did so many people die? You know, if we were so much better than them, we should have rolled over them in 6 months with 14 casualties, half of which were drunk in a pub. And that's not how it works out. But then when you're able to point out, as Innovating Victory does, well, actually, everyone was working on these technologies and they were utilizing them in different ways. And they were at, you know, the other side gets a vote. The other side has people who are quite smart, and they're maybe utilizing their technology in a way that the Allies aren't expecting. Not only is it's obviously more accurate, which is better for history in general, but it also points out that, you know, when someone's father, grandfather, brother, etc., went to war and didn't come back, it wasn't because they were an idiot who fell victim to slightly more fortunate idiots. It's because they were fighting war against people who are doing their level best to win. The fact the other side didn't win doesn't mean that it wasn't a lethal environment.
I think that's a really fundamental point into any sort of historical inquiry. And I think escaping outside of your own comfort zone, outside of your own narratives, outside of your own national mythologies is really an important thing to do. And I think one of the things that makes your channel as good as it is the fact that you are willing to get a little bit more curious about why things happen and how they happen. And I think that's really important for knowing what happened, because as you said, these are not dumb people we're fighting. They're not idiots. They're all competent and capable, and you know, so are we. And so it's a real struggle. But knowing what the other side was thinking, knowing what they were doing, as far as you can, and doing it in an environment that escapes some of the, I won't say propaganda, but just narrative that applies is really important.
Thank you.
I enjoy extending beyond the standard narrative. I mean, you know, there is a standard narrative, and sometimes it's correct, or at least broadly correct, but you can normally ask the question, well, how did that really happen? And dig deeper. And, you know, the deeper you go, the more levels you tend to find of how that really happened. I mean, you know, Drac, you made the comment, the enemy gets a vote. I mean, sometimes I think there's a tendency to say, well, you know, side A developed a superior technology and then they won. Well, was it really just because of the superior technology? What did side B do in response? You know, there almost always is a response to superior technology. I mean,
well, that's part of the book, is the tit for tat.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
new technology, response, counter response. You know?
Yeah, I mean, the Allies came up with with very potent anti-submarine technologies. The Germans responded. Fortunately for the Allies, you know, the Germans, were not able to respond, in numbers in a timely way. But they weren't static. I think maybe, I'm afraid we're overusing radar a bit, but, radar as an example again, the combination of radar and superior anti-aircraft artillery and good aircraft made it almost suicidal for a Japanese strike group to attack an American carrier group late in World War II.
And they responded by embracing the suicidal aspects.
Yeah.
By saying, well, if it's going to be suicidal, then let's make it intentionally suicidal.
Yeah.
And better our chances of actually, causing significant damage. I mean, the enemy does get a vote, and sometimes it's, as brute force a vote as the divine wind tactics, but there's always a response. And part of what I found interesting in doing the book was, charting the responses to technology, some of which I think were quite unanticipated at the outset. I mean, I go back to radio and the use of radio, and you can see, if you look at radio in the Russo-Japanese War, you can see the light bulbs start to go off in both the Japanese and the Russian Navy of, hey, wait a minute, we can listen to what they're saying. And that hadn't been true for any form of naval signaling, up till that point, at least not at any large scale. And not only that, but wait a minute, we can maybe tell generally where they are by what they're doing. And all of a sudden there's this whole response to radio technology, which, as we say, is so seductive that every Navy has to use it. But now you come to World War I, and the British are realizing, boy, the Germans are talking on the radio quite a bit, and we have sufficiently sophisticated receivers that we can hear what they're saying. Where does that lead you from there?
Yeah,
a whole response in terms of naval intelligence to a new technology where the same kind of naval intelligence simply, the potential for it didn't exist before the technology came on the scene.
Yeah, and I think it also opens up just for general consideration, not only in terms of what could happen in the future, but also, I know some people really like the what ifs. But you've got the big obvious what ifs that people generally indulge in, but this is the kind of thing which highlights what I like to call the subtler what ifs. Because if someone says, "Oh, what," something like, I don't know, what if the Germans had got both Scharnhorst and both Bismarcks and sent them all out? It's like, yeah, okay, it might be an interesting what if to consider, but I think for a historian, the circumstances of how that actually comes about are probably more interesting than the voyage itself. Whereas, like you say, with radio and with World War I and the Germans, it's kind of like, what if the Germans had learned that there's a dial between 0 and 10 and just turned the power of the transmissions down a little bit? It requires far, far less of a departure from reality, but the effects of doing that on British ability to listen into their transmissions, and hence everything that derived from that, is actually probably far, far, far more significant than any theoretical mixing up of these particular ships going out on this one voyage. And also is a lot more grounded in reality, because it wouldn't have taken a massive leap of faith for someone to work that out. But again, I think that it comes back to a point you made earlier, which is that there may be things that seem obvious to us now. In hindsight, it's very obvious to say, well, yeah, just don't broadcast on like a million volts of power. But at that point, no one seemed to have thought about it. So I suppose that's another example, isn't it, of fiction has to make sense. Reality doesn't actually have to. People can do the oddest things.
When you talk about that aspect of history, and how what thing that seems obvious now wasn't obvious then. Going back again to radio, you come to the Germans constructing an operational plan and a set of tactical procedures for submarines in World War II that again, rely on radio at a time when the secret of Room 40 was well out in the interwar period. The Germans knew what the British had done to them.
Yeah, but the Germans took care of that problem by coming up with a system of encrypting their transmissions, which was unbreakable.
Oh yes, and
what's the problem?
Very high frequency transmissions of such short duration that there was no way that they could be successfully DF'd by the British, who successfully DF'd them, and not only successfully DF'd them at land stations, but actually managed to put DF capability on their ships, which the Germans also knew was impossible.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it does, and again, it's another one of these examples of reality not necessarily having to make sense of the Germans are going in with all these policies and procedures, and then you get really odd things happening, like during Bismarck's voyage, where, I mean, okay, unknown to Bismarck, everyone's scrambling, trying to figure out where it's gone, and then you get Admiral Lutyens, and he's just like, I know, I shall now transmit effectively War and Peace back to Central Command. I, Admiral Lutyens, first of my name, would now like to say to half an hour later, there's the British operator like, I think we've got him down to the last atom of his position at this point. And you look at all previous German operating policy with radio, and you're just like, where did he come up with the idea to do this? But he did.
Too bad they transposed the bearings, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it does. That's the kind of. I suppose that's another level of it, isn't it? It's just like you could have all the technology telling you all these things, and then
you got to use it right.
Error creeps in, and oh well, we're off in the wrong direction.
Well, this is one of the major points of the book, though. I think is the fact that technology has to be used in warfare in order to understand what it is and what it does. And people who are taking technology off the shelf. I mean, how long have railguns been under development? I think the first railgun development was 1917. I think the U.S. Navy just finally concluded that they were going to axe that program. Until you use it in a war, you just don't know what it is and how it's going to work. And I think that's something that really struck me in the face, working on this book, was the fact that there was so much ambiguity and so much leeway in how different nations use the same thing.
I mean, navies got surprised again and again by how technology actually worked when they came to use it. And often the best user of the technology was not necessarily the Navy that had the most detailed plans for using it going in, but the Navy that most quickly recognized, hey, wait a minute, this is working, differently than we anticipated it would. Either it's broken and we need to fix it, or the way in which it's being used or can best be used wasn't at all what we thought about before, and now we need to come up with another way of using it.
And technology is just one thing. It's the human systems that use the technology that ultimately is the big difference. I mean, there's that wonderful example in the introduction of the book about the captain of HMS Cleveland, a Hunt class destroyer, talking about how he has, 4 different types of radar, and he has headache. He can listen to enemy transmissions, and he has, he has sonar. He has DF. He has everything, right? But he doesn't have any way to integrate all that information. It's like having a mighty weapon. I use the Buddhist metaphor of bending the bow. He has a mighty bow, but can't bend it. Can't fire that arrow, and things like the Action Information Center or the CIC, Combat Information Center, going back to radar, is an example of how you can take a technology and have it, but until you implement a better human interface, it's not going to deliver the goods. That's a recurrent theme in the book.
Yeah. And I suppose that brings us on to the final part of the question, which is, having worked together on this book and the previous book, and still working together now, what's next? What are you working on at the moment? What can we look forward to in the future?
Lynn.
Well, we don't at the moment have another joint project in mind, although I certainly wouldn't rule one out. We discovered that we worked pretty well together after doing the first one. I mean, our quest to do the second book was because we felt we worked together well the first time around, and I don't think
it was fun. It was fun.
Yeah.
So let's do it again, Lynn.
Yeah, we haven't become disenchanted after the second one, although at the moment I'm off on my own looking at the naval aspects of the Spanish Civil War. As I said, one of the things I like about history, about historical study, is the ability to look at something and say, hey, wait a minute, let's see how this really happened. And there's a lot about the naval aspects of the Spanish Civil War in Spanish, not very much in English. And I think there's an untold story there. In fact, I've done enough now that I know there's an untold story there that could benefit from a bit more research and a bit more thought and a presentation. Vince, what do you have going on?
What do I have going on? I'm pecking away. I've got a contract. I'm pecking away at a general history of World War II at sea, which is basically, I wrote a magazine article for Naval History magazine a year or two ago called "The Greatest Naval War Ever Fought." So I'm in the process of taking a magazine article and making it into a book. And I'm doing it from a slightly different perspective, as has been done in the past. That Craig Simons and Evan Maudsley, for example, have recently published. Paul Kennedy is another one. Have recently published general histories of World War II at sea. I'm doing the same thing, except I'm doing it from a much more, from a different perspective. And I'm focusing more on some of the minor navies. What does it take to be a neutral navy, for example? The case of Norway in 1940 shows you how important it is for neutral countries to stand up for their rights. I'm taking it from the point of view of sea power as it applies to Poland. What does sea power mean to Poland? Why was it so important to Poland? And it was. I think there's a lot of information about the Second World War at sea that really gets kind of lost in the general narrative. So I'm kind of exploring some of those hidden byways within the framework of a larger general narrative. I mean, the French-Thailand naval war has never really been explored that much. A couple of random articles. I'll look upon that as in the context of sea power in the larger setting of Southeast Asia. Things like that. So it's years away from being completed, but that's what I'm working on now.
Well, there you go. Two more books to look forward to in the future, coming to a good press near you at some point, and I'm sure we'll hear more about them as the work continues on those.
Well, your channel is the first general admission I've made to that, so
hey,
I guess it's out of the
bag. You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, and I'm gonna take this opportunity and stick a picture of the cover up on the screen of Innovating Victory. And there it is. And I'll make one comment. Coming up with titles for books is really hard. You wouldn't believe how many titles we chewed over before we finally came up with one that the publisher and that the authors could agree upon, and even that, And the cover art.
That was a struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, what even do you conceive of as the cover art for a book that talks about 6 technologies? We went down a number of different roads.
Yeah,
our wives were consulted. Made good suggestions. Better than ours.
So, well, yeah, there you go. So, Innovating Victory, everybody. It's available at various places. Links will be appearing in the video description below. I'll try and include several links to different outlets across the world. So wherever you are, hopefully there'll be one near you. Please do pick it up if you're at all interested in naval history. And let's face it, you're watching a naval history channel. You're coming to I don't know how long the recording's gone on, about just over an hour. So if at this point you are still listening to us, I'm going to make a small wager that you're probably interested in naval history, at which point you should probably read the book, because as I say, it will teach you stuff that you didn't know, It will obviously tell you a few things that hopefully you did already know. And as Len pointed out, it's also an excellent starting point via the bibliography if you really want to get down into the detail of any one of the particular technologies that have been covered in the book itself. So definitely one to pick up. Although, of course, I must make a very small admission, which is, of course, that Vince was very kind to gift me a copy when we met up in San Diego earlier this year. So my copy is better because it's author signed.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to meet you in San Diego, and I really enjoyed how great company you and Mrs. Drock were, and enjoyed showing you off a little bit of my town, my naval town, and look forward to seeing you in San Diego next February too.
And if you bring the book back to San Diego with you in February, you can get the second author to sign it also.
There you go.
There you go. Right. Well, I guess I know what's going in my first in my luggage then. All right. Well, thanks very much to both of you. Thank you, Vince, for coming back yet again to the channel, and Len for your debut.
Thank you for the invitation.
And hopefully this won't be the last time for either of you either. So thanks for being here. Thanks everyone for listening, and see you again another time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, and ciao. Bye.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.